everyone, and welcome back to another video. PvP Season 34 is already underway, and with the last balance patch shaking up the meta, it's time I gave you guys an updated ranked tier list for all 36 specializations. I've divided the tiers from S to F, S being the best and F being the worst, so let's get right into it. First up on the list is Core Guardian. I'm gonna put this one at A tier. It's still a very solid support, a lot of instant cast skills, so there's not really much for the enemy to interrupt. However, it's weakened to Harbingers. If there's 1 or 2 Harbingers on the enemy team, they're going to corrupt all of the stab and turn it into fear. So yeah, A tier for this. DH is still a solid ranked carry. I'm going to put this one at B tier. Overall, it's pretty good, but it's countered by Tempest, which has a lot of reflex. Firebrand goes in your trolling tier. It's pretty weak right now. Probably wouldn't play Firebrand. Willbender, I would put this one at probably the low end of C or high end of D. Willbender does a lot of damage, still has good utility. However, it's not self-sufficient, meaning you need a team to play around. If you are the only person on your team you can rely on, this spec is fairly RNG when it comes to winning your matches. Core Warrior, I'm going to put this one at D tier as well. You can do okay on it as a side noter, but there are much better options right now, and Core Warrior will struggle into certain matchups that have very high sustain. Berserker is also underperforming right now. I would probably put it a little bit higher than D tier. Maybe it can go very low C. You can play Condi Berserker pretty successfully as a side noter. However, it does struggle into matchups with a lot of Condi cleanse and or sustain. Spellbreaker right now is pretty good. I would put this one at B tier. It's not as consistent of a carry spec as some other specs would be. You can win your 1v1s very easily as a Spellbreaker because they have very low cooldown, high impact skills. So even if you are not a mechanical god, you can generally put a lot of pressure on people in 1v1 scenarios. However, in order to beat the meta specs, you're going to need to know how to play Spellbreaker well and actually outplay people. So it is pretty good right now, but not a super consistent carry spec. Bladesworn, I would put this at D tier as well. I honestly feel that Berserker is higher value than Bladesworn right now. So Bladesworn was S or A tier in the previous meta for ranked. However, the nerfs impacted the build pretty heavily, and I would say right now it's probably not the best option to play in ranked. Now, Core Rev also goes in D tier. It's not super high impact. It kind of plays similarly to a Renegade in terms of role, where it can kind of do everything, but doesn't really excel in any particular category. Now, Heralds, I would say this goes in A tier. Now, the weird thing about Herald is that it's kind of a win more spec. If your team is already winning or favored to win, Heralds can snowball a map very easily and just push advantages everywhere. However, if your team is behind, you do not have much solo carry potential on a Herald. You can't really hold out numbered fights. You can't really 1v1 into a lot of different specs. So if you are winning and your team is favored, Herald is definitely A tier for ranked. However, if your team is struggling a little bit more or you're not really sure how the matchups are going to go, I would probably put Herald in C tier. So between A or C, it really depends on the comp. Because it's so comp reliant, I'm tempted to put it in C, but it is a very strong ranked carry when it does pop off. So I'm going to leave this one in A tier, but it's very situational. Now, Renegade right now is also underperforming. It doesn't really do that much, and since most of the damage is from projectiles, a Tempest can very easily shut a Renegade down, and the melee pressure isn't too high either. Now, Vindicator is really good overall. It's super consistent. It can't snowball and take control of a match as well as some other specs can. However, you can generally always get value no matter where you go as a Vindicator. You can take your 1v1s, you can run around the map and get decaps with all the mobility you have, you can hold out numbered fights, and you're also really good in team fights with your Blue Alliance stance. So Vindicator, solid carry spec right now. It does very well in the current ranked meta, and you'll generally perform pretty well if you play it. Now, Core Ranger. I would put Core Ranger in D tier as well. You can do okay on it. You can take certain 1v1 matchups. It's not great overall. You just don't have the damage to win certain 1v1 matchups because the current meta side noters have a ton of sustain. and you're not really going to debunk certain ones like Catalyst or Vindicator either, because they have access to so much stability. Now, Druid is interesting. The buffs definitely help to Druid, but it still needs a lot of work. I would put this at the very low end of C tier or high end of D. You do have a lot of utility for team fights. You can deal a lot of damage. The problem is the CA cooldown is too long to get any sort of consistent and reliable value out of it. So when you are effective, you're pretty effective. But when your class mechanic is not available to you, Druid feels pretty underwhelming. It feels better than a core ranger, but overall it's not that great. You're not going to be able to consistently carry matches as a Druid, especially into heavy condies. Now, Soul Beast, I would put this one and maybe like mid to high D tier. You can do well on a Soul Beast. Now, One Wolf Pack Soul Beast is a good potential counter pick into something like a Deadeye, for example, or any stealth based classes. However, the burst is primarily projectile based, so it gets shut down by projectile denial, and there is a lot of projectile denial in the meta at the moment. So as for Poison Soul Beast as a side noter, it's just very low damage, doesn't really do that much. You're not going to kill high sustain side noters. Now, Untamed, I would put in A tier. It's one of the best specs you can play in ranked. However, it is also extremely comp reliant. It's similar to Herald in that it either would go in A or C. Now, if you're not up against a lot of Condi, so if the enemy team is mainly power damage and there's nothing that really threatens your pet, and if you are not the only damage dealer on your team, Untamed can do very well. Now, the reason why I said Untamed can do well if it is not the only damage dealer on your team is because if you are the only damage dealer, it's very easy to shut an Untamed down. If you're the only threat on your team to the enemy in terms of downing people, the enemy, all they have to do is just focus you, and it becomes much more difficult to line up your bursts. Now, Untamed is also the worst ranger spec to play into Condi. So if the enemy team has one or more condition damage dealers, especially ones that deal burning or torment or poison, your pet just dies on Untamed, and then you're very useless because the pet swap cooldown triples and it disables half your traits. You lose your damage, you lose your survivability, you have to break combat. If people follow you, you're kind of screwed. So Untamed either A or C. For the most part, with what's being played right now, I'd probably put Untamed in A tier. However, once people start to play more counters, like maybe DP Deadeye or anything that does a lot of Condi damage in team fights, Untamed is going to fall. Also, Tempest does a pretty good job at shutting down an Untamed, and Hammer Catalyst is a very big counter on side nodes, and then like a Strength Spellbreaker is also good into a 1v1. So if you're able to play it as a roamer, Untamed can do very well. Now, Core Thief, definitely underperforming. It can do a lot of damage. However, it has less overall impact on a match when compared to other Thief specs. I would put Daredevil at the very low end of B tier or high C right now. It's kind of hard to pick. I'm probably going to put it on C tier. The nerfs to Stealth on Steel hurt the damage capabilities of Daredevil. You can no longer Heartseeker, steal, and then like backstab someone for 6 to 8k damage, so it lost some threat there. It still has a ton of mobility and you can play the map really effectively as a Daredevil, but not being able to kill people as quickly as you could before definitely drops Daredevil from A into either B or C. You can still do very well if you know how to cluster bomb effectively. You can still pump out a ton of damage. However, overall, there are a lot higher impact specs in the current meta. Now, Deadeye is interesting. I would put Deadeye in either A or C tier as well. It's similar to Untamed and Herald in that when you're not going up against anything that counters it, and there are counters for these three specs, a Deadeye can absolutely run away with the game and carry your team. However, if you're up against a ton of projectile denial, like let's say if there's a Tempest and a Hammer Kata on the enemy team, or you're going up against, you know, maybe CPCs from Necros or Mesmers running Reflect on Distort, Deadeye isn't going to really be able to use Rifle that much. However, when you're not up against a significant amount of projectile denial, Deadeye is very likely in A tier. Now, Spectre is also interesting. I think overall, Spectre is underperforming with the nerfs to the Shadow Shroud health pool. However, you can still do very well on a Spectre. It can either go in B, C, or D tier. If you can play Spectre very well, I still think you have a lot of impact, and it can probably go in B tier. However, I think overall, overall, as a solo queue spec, I would probably put it in high C tier. It can really go in low B or high C, I would say. Now, core NG, you're trolling if you play it. It's just really bad right now. Don't play that spec. Now for Scrapper lost the quickness Scrapper mortar builds in the last patch. Unfortunately, it was a pretty good spec to play in ranked for a team fighter. However, right now I would say Scrapper is definitely underperforming. You can kind of get away with some meme specs like a toolkit grenade kit build where you magnet pull someone from stealth, so there's no animation to that, and grenade barrage them for like 8k health. However, overall, I would say Scrapper is not doing too hot at the moment. It doesn't really shine in any particular aspect when compared to a lot of other specs. Now, Hollowsmith, I would put Hollowsmith in high B or very low A tier. Tools Hollow is an extremely strong snowball spec. If you start to get kills and you can snowball the enemy team, a Tools Hollow can stagger the enemy team for the entire game. It has a ton of CCs, great mobility, good mid-range and melee damage. You can absolutely carry your games on a Tools Hollow. However, the weakness of the Tools Hollow is that it only runs one stun break. So if your team starts to fall behind and you have to hold outnumbered fights, you can get CC locked pretty easily on Tools Hollow, which is definitely an issue. Now, if you have like a core guardian support on your team that's able to give you stab, Tools Hollow becomes significantly better. As for Nade Hollow, overall, very consistent spec. However, it is still not the best spec to play into Condis. Cauterize from the Hollowsmith heal tool belt skill, it got buffed, so you have more access to Condi clear now. However, if you're going up against someone that has very long duration and or very frequently applied conditions, I would say Nade Hollow drops in effectiveness. Now, Mechanist depends on the division you're playing in. If you're in like, say like low gold or below, I would probably put Mechanist at A tier. I think overall it just does a lot of damage when people don't know how to line of sight or have access to a lot of reflex. However, the instance the enemy team knows what they're doing, or let's say you hit high gold or plat and the enemy team start to have tempests and hammer catalysts that actually know how to use their magnetic auras, I would say Mechanist drops to D tier. Now, it still has a lot of damage in team fights with the orbital strikes. However, when you're up against permanent projectile denial, and certain classes or combinations of classes can maintain permanent projectile denial, the Mechanist actually just straight up doesn't deal any damage. So if you push bad matchups where like you actually can't deal any damage at all, Mechanist probably drops to your trolling. However, I would probably put it at like the low end of the mid to low end of D tier, depending on how well you know how to play it. And I would also say for Mechanist, the skill ceiling isn't very high on it. So even if you are a very good NG player or a good Mechanist player, you're not really going to get much more effectiveness out of it as compared to someone who is a very average Mechanist player. So probably somewhere around here. Now, Core Necro, it depends on the build you play. Minionmancer is definitely underperforming. It would probably go in D tier. However, if you play a Fearmancer, Core Necro could probably go in mid C tier. I would hesitate to put it in the low end of B. I think overall it can be very annoying to deal with a good Core Necromancer, especially for running Tempest, for example. They have a lot of unblockable boon corrupts with the Shroud 2, for example. However, you can get shut down by specs that have a lot of range damage or Condi clears, especially ones that can run you down as well if you don't have a good support that's able to keep you alive. Now, Reaper, it's very comp dependent. I would probably put it in the low end of B tier or the high end of C. If you're not up against anything that really shuts you down and you have like a good team fight comp, Reaper's definitely B tier. However, if you don't have a support and the enemy team has a lot of range damage or classes that can shred through your shroud very quickly and you can't really land damage on them reliably, Reaper definitely goes into C. However, I think overall Power Reaper is likely more in B tier than C. Now, Scourge is overall, I think, fairly weak at the moment. It just doesn't have very high impact, although you can sway some team fights with the barrier and Condi Cleanse and might you give your team. I think overall Scourge is definitely D tier right now. Now, Harbinger overall is not too bad. It isn't as big of a carry spec as it used to be with the nerfs to boon duration on the elite skill. However, Torment got buffed recently, and I think into certain classes that have a lot of stability, Harbinger can do very well because you can just corrupt their stab into fear and it gets much more annoying for them. I think overall I would probably put Harbinger in the mid to high end of B tier. However, it is very hard countered by Tempests, and Tempests are the meta support at the moment. So if you're up against a lot of projectile denial, a Harbinger's effectiveness goes down to, I would say, the mid to high end of C tier or the very low end of B. Although if you're not up against a Tempest and you're up against like an enemy core guard support, if you have like 1 or 2 Harbingers on your team, you can absolutely shred those matchups in the team fights and yeah, and have a good chance of winning the game. Now, Core Ellie also goes in your trolling. It's really weak at the moment. Just don't play it. If you have the expansions and you can avoid playing Core Ellie, don't play it. Tempest is the only spec at the moment I would put in S tier. It doesn't have anything that really shuts it down. Overall, it's pretty good in all matches. There's very small amounts of combinations of specs on the enemy team that could make a Tempest have a difficult time in a match, but overall, Tempest is just very solid at the moment. It shuts down a lot of different damage specs. It's got great sustain, survivability, it's got great team utility, and it can contribute to kills as well with the amount of crowd control it has. Now, Weaver overall, I would say it's underperforming, but a good Weaver probably, I would say it's probably like mid to high C tier or the very low end of B. It really depends on the matchups you're taking on the enemy team. So for example, if you're up against a lot of power damage dealers on side nodes, you can play Lightning Rod Weaver, and the constant CCs and the weakness sometimes is very difficult for them to deal with. If you're up against Condis or any ranger specs on side nodes, you can just play Fire Weaver and you hard counter them. Fire Weaver also has pretty good contribution to team fights as well because the burning damage is really good for cleaving downed bodies and it gives boons and projectile denial to your team. Depends on what you run, but if you're counter picking properly, I would say Weaver is definitely like the higher end of C tier. Now, Catalyst is really good at the moment. I would probably put it in high B tier. It is like the best side noder at the moment in my opinion. However, it's not a carry spec in the way that some of these other A tier specs are. Now, if you're pushing far on Catalyst, for example, like playing Hammer Catalyst, you push far. If the enemy team decides to 1v3 you or 1v2 you over and over again, and you're constantly getting outnumbered value on a Hammer Catalyst, it probably goes up into A tier. Hammer Catalyst is still exceptionally hard to kill, and it has a lot of impact in team fights as well. Great sustain, boon uptime, tons of AoE damage as well. However, I'm going to put it in B tier because it is reliant on how well you know how to play it into certain matchups. So for example, Strength Spellbreaker versus Hammer Catalyst. If you don't know how to play Hammer Catalyst well, or you don't know how to take the matchup into Spellbreaker, a Strength Spellbreaker can definitely kill a Hammer Catalyst in a 1v1 pretty easily. It's got a lot of CCs, a lot of damage. So if you're not dodging properly, Hammer Catalyst can die pretty quickly. However, if you know how to take your matchups, Hammer Catalyst kind of beats everything else. So depends on the player. I would put Hammer Catalyst high B tier. Now for Core Mesmer, I am hesitant to put this in your trolling tier. I think it's like the very low end of D. I still think Core Mesmer can do well in matches. However, I think overall it's fairly weak and there's no reason to play it over other Mesmer specs. Now for Chrono, it's pretty interesting. It can either go in anywhere from A to C tier in my opinion. If you know how to play Power Chrono really well and you can time your CCs and you know how to execute your burst, I would say that Power Chrono probably goes in the high end of B tier. However, it does get shut down by a combination of range damage and Condis. So if you're up against either of those, Chrono probably goes in C tier. However, if you're not up against that, I feel like Chrono is a very good ranked carry as a power damage dealer. You can blow up team fights with the amount of damage you have between multiple gravity wells, or maybe you run the MOA Elite Signet instead. And as for side node Chrono, I feel like that one is in B or C as well. I would say like maybe the low end of B for carrying and ranked, or the high end of C it can debunk pretty quickly when you drop all your wells and continuum split, so you can like drop all your wells again, and there's just too much damage on the node for people to stand in, and you're also like pulsing Aegis on yourself, so people can't really trade with you very effectively. However, you can't control a game on the side node Condi Chrono as well as you can with some of the other A tier specs. Now, Mirage overall, I would say this is pretty underperforming. It just doesn't have very high impact at the moment. Depending on how good you are at Mirage, I could say it maybe moves up to C tier, but I definitely would have put it any higher than that. Now, Virtuoso is also interesting. It doesn't really die if you know how to play it properly. However, it doesn't really have the damage to consistently win 1v1s in a reasonable amount of time. I would put Virtuoso in like mid to high C tier. If you're trolling the enemy team and they're feeding into you over and over again in outnumbered fights and you're just holding it and not dying forever, then you can get value. It's kind of similar to a Catalyst in that way. However, I would say you can't really control a match very well on Virtuoso. And that's the updated tier list for season 34 of Ranked. This is how I value all of the specs at the moment in the current meta. Now, S tier, always good. You can always play this spec in any match and you'll generally be able to get a lot of value out of it. Now, carry specs, these are ones that are also very good and you can control matches with. However, some of them are very comp dependent, so they'll move up or down depending on if you're going up against your counters or not. Now, B, you can generally get good value out of these specs if you know how to play them well, but if you don't know how to play them well, they probably drop down to tier. Now, C tier specs are very comp reliant. You can do well on them. However, there are a lot more specs that do well into you if you're playing one of these specs than you do well into. Now, D tier, underperforming. I think generally speaking, you can play these and have success with them, but they are not very consistent. There's going to be a lot of matches where you feel like you really don't do that much, or you could have been playing a spec that has a higher impact and then you just don't have the impact you want in ranked. Especially when you're solo queue, I'd probably stay away from these unless you're very, very sure that the people you're playing into and the specs they're playing are favorable matchups for you to take. And then just avoid F tier. You're kind of trolling your teams if you're picking these. And yeah, if you enjoy the content, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and go check out the other videos on the channel if you want to learn more about PvP. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.